7 cookies sat unsold on Lin Yu Ying's tray when the laughter started, and she already knew, before she turned around, exactly what had caused it. Someone had knocked the lion-shaped cookies onto their sides, and in the gray December light of Miller's Gulch, Montana Territory, 1878, they looked less like the proud beast she had carved into the dough, and more like something a child had scribbled with a shaking hand. "Look at that!" a woman's voice carried across the square, pitched just loud enough to be heard by everyone, and just quiet enough to pretend it hadn't been meant that way. "What in the world are those supposed to be?" Yu Ying kept her eyes on the tray. 22 years old, a widow for 11 months, and she had learned in that time that the fastest way to lose ground in this town was to answer an insult with her face instead of her hands. She straightened the cookies one by one, turning each so the almond eyes and the sugared mane faced outward, the way her husband's grandmother had taught her back in Canton, before the ship, before the wagon, before any of it. "They're lions," she said, not loudly, just clear enough to answer the question that had been asked. "For good fortune. My husband's family made them every winter." "Well, your husband's family isn't here, is it?" said the same woman, Bertha Cole's cousin from the Mercantile, and a ripple of laughter went through the small crowd gathered near the frozen well. Someone else pointed. A man Yu Ying didn't recognize picked one of the fallen cookies up between 2 fingers like he was afraid it might bite him, and turned it over, squinting at the crimped edges of what was supposed to be a mane, and clearly, to him, looked like nothing at all. The market at Miller's Gulch ran from first light until the church bell rang 3, and Yu Ying had learned to claim the same corner spot near the well every week, close enough to the crowd's foot traffic to catch buyers, but far enough from the Mercantile awning that Bertha Cole's cousin could not lean over and comment on her wares without crossing the square to do it. She had baked since well before dawn, feeding the small iron stove until her cabin smelled of butter and ginger and the particular sweetness of the sugar she rationed carefully through the winter months, and she had carried the trays the 3 miles into town balanced across a plank in the bed of a borrowed handcart because she owned no wagon of her own and could not yet afford one. Her husband, Chin Wei, had built that handcart himself the autumn before he died, whittling the axle smooth with a patience she still missed more than she let herself admit some mornings. He had promised her, the year they left San Francisco for the Territory, that a person could build a life anywhere so long as they brought their hands and their stubbornness with them, and she had believed him then, the way a new wife believes her husband about most things, without testing the claim too hard. 11 months a widow had tested it plenty since, and some days the claim held, and some days it did not, and this particular December morning, with the cookies scattered and the laughter still ringing in her ears, it had not held at all. She had 60 cookies left on the tray, and $4 in coin in her apron pocket, the whole of what she had earned since sunup, and both of those numbers mattered more than the laughter did, or so she told herself. Her cabin needed its roof patched before the real snow came. The general store would not extend credit to a widow with no husband's name behind her, whatever the law in this territory said about a woman's right to hold her own claim. She needed every coin the market would give her, and she needed the town to buy her cookies, despite whatever they thought of the shapes she made them in. That was when the rancher came around the corner of the dry goods store, moving slow the way big men do when they don't want to startle anyone, and stopped at the edge of the crowd. Nathaniel Briggs. She knew his name because everyone in Miller's Gulch knew his name, even a widow who kept mostly to herself. He ran 400 head of cattle on land his father had claimed under the Homestead Act back before the war, and he had buried a wife 2 winters past. And since then, he came to town on market days and bought exactly what he needed and spoke to exactly no one more than the transaction required. He picked up one of the fallen cookies. The crowd's laughter thinned out a little, watching him, the way a room goes quiet when someone unpredictable walks in. He turned the cookie over once in his weathered hand, studying the crimped mane, the 2 raisin eyes pressed into the dough. He did not smile the way the others expected him to. He took a bite instead, right there in the cold, chewing slow, and something in his face changed that Yu Ying could not read yet because she did not know him well enough to read it. "It tastes like home," he said. Nobody laughed after that. Bertha's cousin opened her mouth to say something and then closed it again, because there was nothing funny left in the moment for her to hang a joke on. Yu Ying stood very still behind her tray, her hands gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather, because she had not expected kindness today, and she did not know what to do with it now that it had arrived. "You knew someone who made these," she said. It was not quite a question. It was the only thing she could think to say that did not sound like thank you, because thank you felt too small for what had just happened in front of half the town. "My mother," Nathaniel said. "She was from San Francisco. Her people came over during the gold years. She used to make something close to this every December before she passed." He set 2 coins on the edge of Yu Ying's table, more than the going price for a single cookie, and did not wait for change. "I'll take a dozen if you have 'em." The crowd was already breaking apart, the way crowds do once the entertainment stops being entertaining, but Yu Ying noticed that a few of them glanced back at the rancher with something like reconsideration, as if his opinion of the strange little cookies mattered more than their own had a moment ago. She counted out 12 lions into a cloth sack, careful with the fragile ones, aware the whole time of the man standing across the table watching her hands work. "You don't have to buy a dozen out of pity," she said, because she had learned that too, in 11 months of widowhood, that pity dressed itself up as kindness more often than people wanted to admit. "I don't buy anything out of pity," Nathaniel said. "Feed's too expensive for that kind of thinking. I buy what I want." He picked up the sack once she'd finished tying it. "That's the first thing that's tasted like anything in 2 years." He left without another word, the way he'd come, and Yu Ying stood there with $4.25 in her apron and a strange, unfamiliar warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the wood stove she'd have to bank down for the night. She did not see him again for 11 days, though she thought about the way he'd said it tastes like home more than she meant to, turning it over the way she'd turned the dough for her cookies, trying to understand what exactly it was that had moved a man like that to speak in front of a crowd that had just been laughing. The second time she saw him, it was not at the market. It was at the edge of her own claim, 3 miles outside town, and the reason he had come was not cookies at all. It was because half the roof over Yu Ying's cabin had come down in the first real snow of the season, and she had spent 2 days trying to patch it herself with green lumber and nails bent from use, and on the 3rd morning she had woken to find a wagon in her yard and a man already up on the roof with a hammer she did not recognize. "You didn't ask me to come," she said, standing in the yard with her shawl pulled tight, her breath fogging in the cold. "No," Nathaniel agreed, not looking down from the roof line. "Wasn't asking permission either. Word travels in this town. Yours travels slower than most because nobody bothers to carry it, but it travels." "I can fix my own roof." "Didn't say you couldn't." He set another shingle, the hammer strikes clean and economical, a man who had done this work 1,000 times before and would do it 1,000 times again without complaint. "Said I was here anyway. You want to argue about it, you can argue at me from up here where it's colder. Or you can put a pot of something on that stove of yours, because a man works better with something warm waiting when he's done." She stood there a long moment, weighing the offer against everything 11 months of widowhood had taught her about accepting help from men who wanted something in return. But there was nothing calculating in the way he swung the hammer, nothing that suggested he was keeping some ledger of favors owed. So she went inside and put the pot on, and by the time the light started to go gray in the afternoon, the roof was whole again, and Nathaniel Briggs sat at her small table eating stew out of a chipped bowl like it was the finest meal he'd had in months. Your mother, Yu Ying said, watching him eat. The one who made the cookies. What was her name? Li Hua, he said, and something in his voice changed the way it had that first day in the square. My father called her Lucy, because that's what the town would accept easier, and she let him because it was easier for both of them. But she told me her real name when I was old enough to keep it private. Said a person ought to have one name that belongs only to the people who love them true. Yu Ying set down her spoon. You've never told anyone that name before. No, Nathaniel said. Don't rightly know why I'm telling you now, except that you make cookies shaped the same way she did, and you got laughed at in a square full of people who wouldn't know the difference between kindness and cruelty if you drew them a map. He looked up at her, his eyes steady in the lamplight. That struck something in me I hadn't let anyone strike in a long while. She understood then that the stew she'd made, plain and thin as it was, had become something more than food between them, the same way as hammer strikes on her roof had become something more than a debt of favors owed. She did not have words for what that something was yet, but she recognized, in the quiet after his confession, that whatever had started in the town square 11 days ago was not finished starting. The days between the roof mending and Kellerman's visit passed quiet, and Yu Ying found herself, more than once, standing at her window in the evenings, watching the road that led toward town, though she told herself she was only checking the weather. Nathaniel did not come every day. He had 400 head of cattle to see through the start of winter, and no hands to spare for idle visiting. But he sent word twice through a boy who delivered feed sacks to the outlying claims, short notes asking whether her roof held against the wind and whether she had wood enough banked for the week. She wrote back both times, brief as his notes had been, and found that she looked forward to the boy's arrival with an eagerness she had not expected to feel about anything so small. On the fourth evening she walked out to the edge of her claim just to watch the sun go down behind the ridge, the sky burning orange and then a deep bruised purple over the mountains. And she thought about the way Nathaniel had said his mother's name, Li Hua, quiet and careful, like a thing he had kept wrapped in cloth for safekeeping most of his life. She understood that kind of keeping. She had her own name too, the one her mother had given her before the crossing, and she had noticed that most of the town called her simply Mrs. Lin, or worse, that widow woman, as though Yu Ying itself were too much trouble to learn. Nathaniel had never once stumbled over it. He said it plain and correct the very first time, and she had noticed that too, the way a person notices small kindnesses more sharply once larger ones have gone missing from their life. The trouble began the way trouble in Miller's Gulch usually began, with money and land and a man named Otis Kellerman who owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties and did not care to see his margins narrowed by anyone he considered beneath consideration. Kellerman had wanted Yu Ying's claim for 2 years, ever since her husband died of fever the winter before last, and left her, in the eyes of most of the territory, an unlikely candidate to hold on to 40 acres of good water frontage on her own. He had made his first offer within a month of the funeral, polite as a church deacon, explaining in a voice that never once rose above conversational how difficult it must be for a woman alone to manage land, how generous his offer truly was given the circumstances, how much simpler her life would become once the burden of the claim was lifted from her shoulders. She had refused him then, and she refused him again now, 3 days after Nathaniel finished her roof, when Kellerman rode out to her cabin himself with 2 of his hired men trailing behind him like shadows that had learned to sit a horse. "Mrs. Lin," Kellerman said, tipping his hat with a courtesy that made the hair on Yu Ying's arms rise despite the cold. "I hear you've had some difficulty with your roof this season. Shame that. A woman alone shouldn't have to bear repairs like that on her own account." "The roof is fixed," Yu Ying said. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Kellerman, But there's nothing here that requires your attention. There's the matter of your husband's claim filing, Kellerman said. Still pleasant, still polite. The kind of politeness that Yu Ying had already learned, in her short time in this territory, to fear more than shouting. I've had my lawyer look into the paperwork on your behalf. There's some question as to whether the filing transferred properly to you upon your husband's passing, given the particulars of territorial law regarding a wife of your particular circumstances. My circumstances, Yu Ying repeated, are that I am his widow, and the claim is mine under the law, same as any widow's claim in this territory. Perhaps, Kellerman said. Perhaps not. These things can take a great deal of time and expense to sort out properly in a territorial court. Time and expense a woman in your position might find difficult to bear alone. I'd hate to see you lose the claim entirely to legal costs, when a straightforward sale to me would spare you all that trouble, and put real coin in your pocket besides. He left without waiting for an answer, the way powerful men in this territory often did, secure in the knowledge that his words would keep working on her long after he'd ridden out of earshot. Yu Ying stood in her yard and watched him go, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt something colder than fear settle into her chest. Kellerman was not a man who made empty threats. If he said he had a lawyer looking into her filing, he had a lawyer looking into her filing. And territorial courts in 1878 did not move quickly or cheaply, and a widow with $4 and change to her name could not afford to fight a man who owned half the county in a contest of paperwork and patience. She rode into town that same afternoon, cold fear driving her faster than good sense usually allowed, and found Nathaniel at the livery stable, checking a mare's foreleg with the same economical competence he'd shown on her roof. Kellerman came to my claim, she said, and watched his hands go still on the mare's leg. Tell me exactly what he said. His voice had gone flat, controlled, the voice of a man setting aside one kind of attention to give her a different, sharper kind. She told him. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening once when she repeated the phrase, "A woman of your particular circumstances." And when she finished, he was quiet long enough that she began to wonder if he intended to say anything at all. Kellerman's tried this before, he said finally. Not with you, with 3 other claims south of the river these last 4 years. Widows mostly, or men with no family to back them in a fight. He finds some question of paperwork, real or invented, and he lets the fear of a courtroom do the rest of the work for him. Most folks sell before it ever gets that far, because the cost of proving him wrong is more than the land's worth to anyone but Kellerman himself. And if I don't sell? Then we find your husband's original filing, Nathaniel said, and we find whoever witnessed it, and we make sure that paperwork is in a territorial clerk's hands before Kellerman's lawyer can claim it never existed properly at all. He straightened from the mare's leg and looked at her directly. I'm not offering to fix this for you. I'm offering to stand beside you while you fix it yourself, because I expect you're the kind of woman who needs to win her own fights, and I respect that a great deal more than I'd respect a woman who let me win it for her. Something in Yu Ying's chest loosened at that, a tension she had been carrying since her husband's funeral without fully realizing its weight. Nobody in this territory had offered her that kind of respect before. The assumption that she was capable, rather than the assumption that she needed rescuing. She had grown so used to bracing against pity or dismissal that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen as simply competent. The filing is in a strong box at my cabin, she said. My husband kept careful records. He always said a man's word is worth exactly as much as the paper he's willing to put behind it. Then let's go get that paper, Nathaniel said, before Kellerman's lawyer decides the territorial clerk's office had a fire that conveniently destroyed the original copy. They rode back to her claim together as the light started failing, and Yu Ying found the strong box exactly where her husband had left it, tucked beneath a floorboard in the small bedroom she had not fully unpacked since his death, as though some part of her had known she might need to leave quickly and had never let herself settle in fully. The filing was there, dated and signed, with the mark of the territorial clerk from the year they'd arrived, and beneath it a second paper she had never read before, a letter in her husband's careful hand addressed to her and dated only 3 weeks before the fever took him. She read it standing in the lamplight while Nathaniel waited outside to give her privacy, and by the time she came back out, her eyes were wet in a way she did not try to hide from him. "He knew he was dying," she said, "before the fever got bad enough that any of us admitted it out loud. He wrote that if anything happened to him, the land was mine outright, no conditions, no expectation that I remarry or sell or do anything but keep what we built together." She folded the letter carefully back into its creases. "He knew someone might try to take it from me. He said as much, right here, that a widow with no family name behind her would always have men circling like Kellerman circles a wounded animal." "He sounds like he knew you well," Nathaniel said quietly. "He knew this territory well," Yu Ying said. "Better than I did when we first arrived. I think that's why he wrote it down. He wanted to make certain the paper spoke for him after he no longer could." She looked up at Nathaniel, the strong box still open on the table between them. "I need to get this to the territorial clerk before Kellerman's lawyer files whatever paperwork he intends to file. But the clerk's office is 2 days' ride from here, and the pass will be closing with the next real snow." "Then we ride tonight," Nathaniel said, "and we ride hard, and we get there before Kellerman's lawyer thinks to wire ahead and grease the wheels against you." They left within the hour, Yu Ying wrapped in every layer of wool she owned, the strong box secured behind her saddle, and Nathaniel riding just ahead of her the whole way, breaking trail through drifts that had already begun to deepen with the season's first serious snow. She had never ridden through a night like that before, the cold biting through wool and leather both, the horse's breath clouding white in the darkness, every mile a fight against weather that seemed determined to close the pass before they could clear it. Somewhere past midnight her horse stumbled on a patch of ice hidden beneath fresh snow, and Yu Ying went down hard, the strong box tumbling loose into a drift, her shoulder taking the worst of the fall against frozen ground. For a moment the world went white and silent, pain radiating down her arm, and she heard Nathaniel's voice calling her name from what sounded like a great distance before he was there beside her, pulling her upright, checking her arm with hands that had gone gentle despite the urgency of the night around them. "Nothing's broken," she said, gritting through the pain, already reaching for the strong box half buried in the drift. "We have to keep moving. If that pass closes before we clear it, Kellerman wins by default, whether his claim has merit or not." "You just took a fall that would have put most men flat on their back for a week," Nathaniel said, but he was already helping her back into the saddle even as he said it, understanding without further argument that stopping was not a choice either of them could afford to make. "You tell me the second that shoulder gets worse than you can bear. I mean it." "I mean to see this through," Yu Ying said, and something in her voice must have convinced him, because he simply nodded and turned his horse back toward the pass, and they rode on through the worst of the night together, her shoulder aching with every stride, but her resolve, if anything, hardened rather than broken by the fall. They reached the territorial clerk's office in the small settlement of Ashford Crossing just past dawn on the second day, exhausted, half frozen, and 3 hours ahead of the rider Kellerman's lawyer had indeed sent, a fact they learned only when that rider arrived to find the filing already properly recorded, witnessed, and stamped with the clerk's official seal. The widow's claim confirmed beyond any question a lawyer might raise. Kellerman's man left without a word, and Yu Ying sat on the clerk's office steps in the cold morning light, her whole body finally allowed to feel the exhaustion it had been holding back through the long night's ride. Nathaniel sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, letting the fear and urgency of the night finally drain out into the quiet of the morning. "I couldn't have done that ride alone," Yu Ying admitted finally. "Not with the fall, not with the cold. I want you to know I see that clearly." "You'd have found another way," Nathaniel said. "I've known you 3 weeks, and I already know that much about you. But I'm glad I didn't have to watch you find it alone, if I'm honest." He looked over at her, something unguarded in his face that she had not seen since the day in the market square when he'd bitten into her cookie and said the words that changed everything. "My wife passed 2 winters back. Fever, same as your husband, though it took her slower and crueler than I'd wish on anyone. I stopped expecting to feel much of anything after that. Told myself the ranch was enough. The cattle were enough. 400 head and good grass, and nothing more required of me than keeping them fed and watered. And now? Now I rode 2 days through a closing pass to help a woman I'd known 3 weeks defend a piece of paper," Nathaniel said. "That's not a man who's satisfied with cattle and grass anymore, whatever he's been telling himself." He was quiet a moment, watching the pale morning light move over the settlement's rooftops. "I'm not asking you for anything, Yu Ying. Your husband's only been gone 11 months, and grief doesn't run on any clock but its own. I just wanted you to know what I know now, plain, without dressing it up in anything fancier than the truth." She sat with that for a long moment, her shoulder aching, her whole body worn through with the ride, and found that the truth of it did not frighten her the way she might have expected. "My husband wrote in his letter that a person ought to keep living even after loss takes something from them," she said. "I think he meant it as permission, though I didn't understand that until just now." She looked over at Nathaniel, meeting his eyes steadily. "I'm not ready for anything more than what this is right now. But I don't want you to stop showing me what this is either." He nodded, understanding the boundary in her words and respecting it without argument, and they sat together on the clerk's office steps until the cold finally drove them both inside to find hot coffee and a warm fire before the long ride home. 3 months passed, and the snow that had nearly closed the pass against them gave way, eventually, to the first thin green of a mountain spring. Yu Ying's claim stood secure, the filing recorded permanently in Ashford Crossing's territorial records, and Kellerman, having lost his gambit against a paper trail that could not be argued away, turned his attention elsewhere and did not trouble her again. There were other changes that spring, too, smaller ones, the kind a person only notices by counting them up after the fact. The school teacher's widowed aunt, a quiet woman named Prudence Hale, who had never once bought a cookie in all the months Yu Ying had sold them, began stopping by the stall each week, not for the lions at first, but for the plain butter cookies Yu Ying baked alongside them. And eventually she asked, awkward and low-voiced, whether Yu Ying might show her the shape of the lion sometime, since her own late husband had spent 2 years in the China trade out of San Francisco before they married, and she found she missed hearing of it in ways she had never expected to. Yu Ying said yes, and the following month the two of them sat at Yu Ying's table for the better part of an afternoon, flour dusting both their aprons, and something in the quiet companionship of it reminded Yu Ying of her mother's kitchen in a way she had not felt since the crossing. Kellerman, for his part, did not vanish from the territory entirely. He kept his cattle operation in his 3 counties of influence, and Yu Ying heard, second-hand through the mercantile, that he had turned his attention to a claim north of the river belonging to a family with grown sons who could stand behind their paper more easily than a widow alone. She felt no triumph in that, only a tired kind of relief, and a private resolve that if word ever reached her of another widow facing the same pressure she had faced, she would ride to their door herself before Kellerman's lawyer ever got the chance to knock on it first. The town had not forgotten the laughter in the market square, not entirely, but something had shifted in the months since. Bertha's cousin bought a dozen lion cookies at the spring market without a hint of mockery in her voice, and 2 other women asked Yu Ying, hesitant but genuine, whether she might teach them the shape some day, the crimped mane, the careful placement of the raisin eyes. She said she would, and found that she meant it, that the shame she had carried into that first market day had worn away into something closer to quiet pride. Nathaniel came to town every market day now, not just to buy cookies, though he still bought a dozen every time without fail, but to sit with her at her table through the slow hours of trade, helping her count coin at the day's end, walking beside her back toward the edge of town where their paths diverged, his toward the ranch, hers toward the claim that was, finally and completely, indisputably, her own. On a morning in late April, with the mountains still capped white above the greening valley, Nathaniel arrived at her cabin not with a hammer this time, but with a small wooden box he'd carved himself, plain and unpolished, the kind of gift that spoke more through its careful construction than any ornament could have. "It's not much," he said, setting it on her table. "Just something to keep letters in. Your husband's if you want to keep 'em separate. Mine if you ever want to write me any, though I don't suppose I'm going far enough for letters to matter much between us." She opened the box and found, tucked into one corner, a small carved lion, roughly made but clearly, unmistakably, an attempt at the shape she made in dough every winter market. "I'm not much of a carver," Nathaniel admitted, watching her turn the small wooden lion over in her hands. "Took me the better part of 6 evenings to get it looking like anything at all." "It looks exactly right," Yu Ying said, and found that her voice had gone soft in a way she hadn't intended. "It looks like it belongs to someone who understands why the shape matters." "I do understand," Nathaniel said. "Took me 30 years and losing 2 people I love to learn that some things carry more weight than their size would suggest. A cookie shaped like a lion, a carved box for keeping letters, a woman standing her ground in a market square while half the town laughed at her." He reached across the table and took her hand, gentle, unhurried, giving her every chance to pull away if she wanted to. "I'm not in any rush, Yu Ying. I just wanted you to have something that told you, plain, what I've been carrying since that first day you handed me a cookie and I bit into something that tasted like every good thing I thought I'd lost for good." She did not pull her hand away. Outside, the spring wind moved through the valley, carrying the smell of thawing earth and new grass, and somewhere down the lane a meadowlark called out over the quiet, and Yu Ying Lin sat in the cabin that was hers by right and by law, holding the hand of a man who had seen past every laughing crowd to something worth staying for, and understood, finally, that home was not a place a person left behind in another country, but something a person could build again, patient and careful, out of dough and wood and the slow accumulation of small, honest kindnesses. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.